Volume 6, The Reformation, by Will Durant. Part 2, continued. Cassette 5, Side 2. If we bear these limiting factors in mind, we may admit a quiet and growing entente between Calvinism and business. Calvin could not long have kept his leadership had he obstructed the commercial development of a city whose commerce was its life. He adjusted himself to the situation, allowed interest charges of 10%, and recommended state loans to finance the introduction or expansion of private industry, as in the manufacture of clothing or the production of silk. Commercial centers like Antwerp, Amsterdam, and London took readily to the first modern religion that accepted the modern economy. Calvinism took the middle classes into its fold and grew with their growth. What were the results of Calvin's rule? The difficulties of enforcement must have been extreme, for never in history had such strict virtue been required of a city. A considerable party opposed the regimen, even to the point of open revolt, but a substantial number of influential citizens must have supported it, if only on the general theory of morals, that others need them. The influx of French Huguenots and other Protestants must have strengthened Calvin's hand, and the limitation of the experiment to Geneva and its hinterland raised the chances of success. The recurrent fear of invasion and absorption by hostile states, Savoy, Italy, France, the Empire, compelled political stability and civic obedience. External danger promoted internal discipline. In any case, we have an enthusiastic description of the results from the pen of an eyewitness, Bernardino Occhino, an Italian Protestant who had found refuge in Geneva. Cursing and swearing, unchastity, sacrilege, adultery, and impure living, such as prevail in many places where I have lived, are here unknown. There are no pimps and harlots. The people do not know what rouge is, and they are all clad in seemly fashion. Games of chance are not customary. Benevolence is so great that the poor need not beg. The people admonish one another in brotherly fashion, as Christ prescribes. Lawsuits are banished from the city, nor is there any simony, murder, or party spirit, but only peace and charity. On the other hand, there are no organs here, no voice of bells, no showy songs, no burning candles or lamps in the churches, no relics, pictures, statues, canopies, or splendid robes, no farces or cold ceremonies. The churches are quite free from idolatry. The extant records of the council for this period do not quite agree with this report. They reveal a high percentage of illegitimate children, abandoned infants, forced marriages, and sentences of death. Calvin's son-in-law and his stepdaughter were among those condemned for adultery. But then again, as late as 1610, we find Valentin Andrei, a Lutheran minister from Württemberg, praising Geneva enviously. When I was in Geneva, I observed something great, which I shall remember and desire as long as I live. There is in that city not only the perfect institute of a perfect republic, but as a special ornament, a moral discipline which makes weekly investigations into the conduct and even the smallest transgressions of the citizens. All cursing and swearing, gambling, luxury, strife, hatred, fraud, etc., are forbidden, while greater sins are hardly heard of. What a glorious ornament of the Christian religion is such a purity of morals! We must lament with tears that it is wanting with us Germans, and almost totally neglected. If it were not for the difference of religion, I would have been chained to Geneva forever. 5. The conflicts of Calvin. Calvin's character harmonized with his theology. The oil painting in the University Library at Geneva pictures him as a severe and somber mystic, dark but bloodless complexion, scanty black beard, high forehead, penetrating, ruthless eyes. He was short and thin and physically frail, hardly fit to carry a city in his hands. But behind the weak frame burned a mind sharp, narrow, devoted, and intense, and a firm, indomitable will, perhaps a will to power. His intellect was a citadel of order, making him almost the Aquinas of Protestant theology. His memory was crowded and yet precise. He was ahead of his time in doubting astrology, abreast of it in rejecting Copernicus, a bit behind it, like Luther, in ascribing many terrestrial occurrences to the devil. His timidity concealed his courage, his shyness disguised an inner pride, his humility before God became at times a commanding arrogance before men. He was painfully sensitive to criticism and could not bear opposition with the patience of one who can conceive the possibility that he may be wrong. Racked with illness, bent with work, he often lost his temper and broke out into fits of angry eloquence. He confessed to Butzer that he found it difficult to tame the wild beast of his wrath. His virtues did not include humor, which might have softened his certainties, nor a sense of beauty, which might have spared ecclesiastical art. Yet he was no unmitigated killjoy. He bade his followers be cheerful, play harmless games like bowling or quoits, and enjoy wine in moderation. He could be a kind and tender friend, and an unforgiving enemy, capable of hard judgments and stern revenge. Those who served him feared him, but those loved him most who knew him best. Sexually, his life showed no fault. He lived simply, ate sparingly, fasted unostentatiously, slept only 6 hours a day, never took a holiday, used himself up without stint in what he thought was the service of God. He refused increases in salary, but labored to raise funds for the relief of the poor. The strength of that heretic, said Pope Pius IV, consisted in this, that money never had the slightest charm for him. If I had such servants, my dominion would extend from sea to sea. A man of such mettle must raise many enemies. He fought them with vigor and in the controversial language of the time. He described his opponents as riffraff, idiots, dogs, asses, pigs, and stinking beasts, epithets less becoming to his elegant Latinity than to Luther's gladiatorial style. But he had provocations. One day, Jérôme Bossuet, an ex-monk from France, interrupted Calvin's sermon at St. Peter's to denounce the predestinarian doctrine as an insult to God. Calvin answered him by citing Scripture. The police arrested Bossuet. The consistory charged him with heresy. The council was inclined to put him to death. But when the opinions of theologians in Zurich, Basel, and Bern were solicited, they proved disconcerting. Bern recommended caution in dealing with problems beyond human ken, a new note in the literature of the age. And Bullinger warned Calvin that many are displeased with what you say in your institutes about predestination, and draw the same conclusions as Bossuet. The council compromised on banishment in 1551. Bossuet returned to France and Catholicism. More important in result was Calvin's controversy with Joachim Westphal. This Lutheran minister of Hamburg denounced as satanic blasphemies the view of Zwingli and Calvin that Christ was only spiritually present in the Eucharist, and thought the Swiss reformers should be refuted not by the pens of theologians, but by the rods of magistrates. This in 1552. Calvin answered him in terms so severe that his fellow reformers at Zurich, Basel, and Bern refused to sign his remonstrance. He issued it nevertheless. Westphal and other Lutherans returned to the attack. Calvin branded them as apes of Luther, and argued so effectively that several regions hitherto Lutheran, Brandenburg, the Palatinate, and parts of Hesse, Bremen, Anhalt, and Baden, were won to the Swiss view and the Reformed Church. Only the silence of Melanchthon, who secretly agreed with Calvin, and the post-mortem echo of Luther's thunderbolts saved the rest of northern Germany for the Lutheran creed. Turning from these assaults on the right, Calvin faced on the left a group of radicals recently arrived in Switzerland from Counter-Reformation Italy. Caelius Secundus Curio, teaching in Lausanne and Basel, shocked Calvin by announcing that the saved, including many heathen, would far outnumber the damned. Lilius Socinus, son of a leading Italian jurist, settled in Zurich, studied Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew in order to understand the Bible better, learned too much, and lost his faith in the Trinity, predestination, original sin, and the atonement. He expressed his skepticism to Calvin, who answered as well as possible. Socinus agreed to refrain from public utterance of his doubts, but later he spoke out against the execution of Servetus, and was among the few who, in that fevered age, stood up for religious toleration. In a state where religion and government were fused in an intoxicating mixture, it was natural that Calvin's most persistent conflicts should be with the patriotes and libertins, who had once expelled him and now deplored his return. The patriots resented his French origin and supporters, abhorred his theology, nicknamed him Cain, and called their dogs Calvin. They insulted him in the streets, and probably it was they who one night fired 50 shots outside his home. The libertins preached a pantheistic creed without devils, angels, Eden, atonement, Bible, or Pope. Queen Margaret of Navarre received and supported them at her court in Iraq, and reproved Calvin for his severity with them. On June 27, 1547, Calvin found attached to his pulpit a placard reading, "Gross hypocrite, you and your companions will gain little by your pains. If you do not save yourselves by flight, nobody shall prevent your overthrow, and you will curse the hour when you left your monkery. After people have suffered long, they avenge themselves. Take care that you are not served like Monsieur Verle, who had been killed. "We will not have so many masters." Jacques Rouet, a leading libertin, was arrested on suspicion of having written the placard. No proof was adduced. It was claimed that he had some days previously uttered threats against Calvin. In his room were found papers, allegedly in his handwriting, calling Calvin a haughty and ambitious hypocrite, and ridiculing the inspiration of the Scriptures and the immortality of the soul. He was tortured twice daily for 30 days until he confessed, we do not know how truthfully, that he had affixed the placard and conspired with French agents against Calvin in Geneva. On July 26th, half dead, he was tied to a stake, his feet were nailed to it, and his head was cut off. Tension mounted until, on December 16, 1547, the Patriotes and Libertins came armed to a meeting of the Great Council and demanded an end to the power of the consistory over the citizens. At the height of a violent tumult, Calvin entered the room, faced the hostile leaders, and said, striking his breast, "If you want blood, there are still a few drops here. Strike then." Swords were drawn, but no one ventured to be the first assassin. Calvin addressed the gathering with rare moderation and finally persuaded all parties to a truce. Nevertheless, his confidence in himself was shaken. On December 17th, he wrote to Viret, "I hardly hope that the Church can be upheld much longer, at least by my ministry. Believe me, my power is broken, unless God stretch forth his hand." But the opposition divided into factions and subsided till the trial of Servetus offered another opportunity. 6. Michael Servetus, 1511 to 1553. Miguel Serveto was born at Villanova, some 60 miles north of Saragossa, son of a notary of good family. He grew up at a time when the writings of Erasmus were enjoying a transitory tolerance in Spain. He was in some measure influenced by the literature of the Jews and the Moslems. He read the Koran, made his way through rabbinical commentaries, and was impressed by the Semitic criticism of Christianity, with its prayers to a Trinity, to Mary, and to saints, as polytheistic. Luther called him the Moor. At Toulouse, where he studied law, he saw for the first time a complete Bible, vowed to read it 1,000 times, and was deeply moved by the visions of the Apocalypse. He won the patronage of Juan de Quintana, confessor to Charles V, and was taken by Juan to Bologna and Augsburg in 1530. Michael discovered Protestantism and liked it. He visited Ecolampadius at Basel and Capito and Butzer at Strasbourg. Soon he was too heretical for their taste and was invited to graze in other fields. In 1531 and 1532 he published the first and second edition of his basic work, De Trinitatis Erroribus. It was rather confused, and in a crude Latin that must have made Calvin smile, if ever. But in wealth of biblical erudition it was an astonishing performance for a lad of 20. Jesus, in Servetus's view, was a man into whom God the Father had breathed the Logos, the divine wisdom. In this sense, Jesus became the Son of God. But he was not equal or co-eternal with the Father, who might communicate the same spirit of wisdom to other men. The Son was sent from the Father in no other way than as one of the prophets. This was pretty close to Muhammad's conception of Christ. Servetus proceeded to take the Semitic view of Trinitarianism. All those who believe in a Trinity in the essence of God are tritheists, and he added they are true atheists as deniers of the one God. This was youthfully extreme, but Servetus tried to soften his heresy by inditing rhapsodies on Christ as the light of the world. Most of his readers, however, felt that he had extinguished the light. As if to leave no stone unhurled, he concurred with the Anabaptists that baptism should be given only to adults. Ecolampadius and Butzer repudiated him, and Servetus, reversing Calvin's itinerary, fled from Switzerland to France in 1532. On July 17th, the Inquisition at Toulouse issued a warrant for his arrest. He thought of going to America, but found Paris more agreeable. There, disguising himself as Michel de Villeneuve, the family name, he studied mathematics, geography, astronomy, and medicine, and flirted with astrology. The great Vesalius was his fellow student in dissection, and their teachers praised them equally. He quarreled with the dean of the medical faculty, and seems in general to have given offense by his impetuosity, passion, and pride. He challenged Calvin to a debate, but did not appear at the appointed place and time, this in 1534. In the furor over Cope's address and the heretical placards, Servetus, like Calvin, left Paris. At Lyon he edited a scholarly edition of Ptolemy's Geography. In 1540 he moved to Vienne, 16 miles south of Lyon, and there he lived till his last year, practicing medicine and scholarship. Out of so many scholars available to the Lyon publishers' printers, he was chosen to edit a Latin translation of the Bible by Sante Spagnini. The work took him 3 years and ran to 6 volumes. In a note on Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, which Jerome had rendered, "A virgin shall conceive," Servetus explained that the Hebrew word meant not virgin, but young woman, and he suggested that it referred not prophetically to Mary, but simply to Hezekiah's wife. In the same spirit, he indicated that other seemingly prophetic passages in the Old Testament referred only to contemporary figures or events. This proved disconcerting to Protestants and Catholics alike. We do not know when Servetus discovered the pulmonary circulation of the blood, the passage of the blood from the right chamber of the heart along the pulmonary artery to and through the lungs, its purification there by aeration, and its return via the pulmonary vein to the left chamber of the heart. So far as is now known, he did not publish his finding till 1553, when he included it in his final work, The Restitution of Christianity. He brought the theory into a theological treatise because he thought of the blood as the vital spirit in man, and therefore, more probably than the heart or the brain, the real seat of the soul. Deferring for a while the problem of Servetus's priority in this discovery, we merely note that he had apparently completed the Christianismi Restitutio by 1546, for in that year he sent the manuscript to Calvin. The very title was a challenge to the man who had written the Christianae Religionis Institutio. But further, the book sharply rejected as blasphemy the notion that God had predestined souls to hell regardless of their merits or guilt. God, said Servetus, condemns no one who does not condemn himself. Faith is good, but love is better, and God himself is love. Calvin thought it sufficient refutation of all this to send Servetus a copy of the Institutes. Servetus returned it with insulting annotations, and followed up with a series of letters so contemptuous that Calvin wrote to Farel, on February 13, 1546, "Servetus has just sent me a long volume of his ravings. If I consent, he will come here, but I will not give my word. For should he come, if my authority is of any avail, I will not suffer him to get out alive." Servetus, angry at Calvin's refusal to continue the correspondence, wrote to Abel Pupin, one of the Genoese ministers, in 1547. "Your gospel is without God, without true faith, without good works. Instead of a God, you have a three-headed Cerberus, the predestinating Trinity. For faith, you have a deterministic dream. Man is with you an inert trunk, and God is a chimera of the enslaved will. You close the kingdom of heaven before men. Woe, woe, woe! This is the 3rd letter I have written to warn you, that you may know better. I will not warn you again. In this fight of Michael I know that I shall certainly die, but I do not falter. Christ will come. He will not tarry." Obviously, Servetus was a bit more insane than the average of his time. He announced that the end of the world was at hand, that the archangel Michael would lead a holy war against both the papal and the Genoese antichrists, and that he, who had been named after the archangel, would fight and die in that war. The Restitutio was a call to that war. No wonder it had difficulty finding a publisher. The Basel printers shied away from it. Finally, on January 3, 1553, it was clandestinely printed in Vienne by Balthazar Annouillet and Guillaume Guéraud. Their names and the place of publication were omitted, and the author signed himself only as MSV. He paid all the expenses, corrected the proofs, and then destroyed the manuscript. The volume ran to 734 pages, for it included a revised form of De Trinitatis Erroribus and Servetus's 30 letters to Calvin. Of the 1,000 copies printed, some were sent to a bookseller in Geneva. There one came into the hands of Guillaume Tree, a friend of Calvin's. The 30 letters made plain to Calvin that MSV stood for Michael Servetus of Villanova. On February 26, 1553, Tree wrote to a Catholic cousin in Lyon, Antoine Arnay, expressing surprise that Cardinal François de Tournon should allow such a book to be printed in his diocese. How did Tree know the place of publication? Calvin knew that Servetus was living in Lyon or Vienne. Arnay brought the matter to Matthias Horry, inquisitor at Lyon. Horry notified the cardinal, who ordered Maugiron, lieutenant governor of Vienne, to investigate. On March 16th, Servetus was summoned to Maugiron's house. Before obeying, he destroyed all papers that might incriminate him. He denied having written the book. Arnay dispatched to Tree a request for more evidence of Servetus's authorship. Tree obtained from Calvin some of Servetus's letters and sent them to Lyon. They tallied with several letters in the book. On April 4th, Servetus was arrested. 3 days later, he escaped by leaping over a garden wall. On June 17th, the civil court of Vienne condemned him, if found, to be burned alive by a slow fire. Servetus wandered about France for 3 months. He decided to seek refuge in Naples and to go via Geneva. For reasons unknown, he remained in Geneva a month under an assumed name, and meanwhile he arranged for transportation to Zurich. On Sunday, August 13th, he attended church, perhaps to avoid investigation by the authorities. He was recognized. Calvin was informed and ordered his arrest. Calvin explained this action in a later letter of September 9, 1553. When the papists are so harsh and violent in defense of their superstitions that they rage cruelly to shed innocent blood, are not Christian magistrates shamed to show themselves less ardent in defense of the sure truth? The small council followed Calvin's lead and outran his ferocity. Since Servetus was only a transient and not a citizen subject to the laws of Geneva, the council could not legally do more than banish him. He was confined in the former episcopal palace, now a prison. He was not tortured, except by the lice that infested his cell. He was allowed paper and ink and whatever books he cared to buy, and Calvin lent him several volumes of the early Fathers. The trial was carefully conducted, lasting over 2 months. The indictment was drawn up by Calvin in 38 articles, supported by quotations from the writings of Servetus. One charge was that he had accepted Strabo's description of Judea as a barren country, whereas the Bible called it a land flowing with milk and honey. The basic accusations were that Servetus had rejected the Trinity and infant baptism. He was also accused of having, in the person of Monsieur Calvin, defamed the doctrines of the gospel of the Church of Geneva. On August 17th and 21st, Calvin appeared in person as the accuser. Servetus defended his views boldly, even to pantheism. By an unusual cooperation of hostile faiths, the Protestant Council of Geneva asked the Catholic judges at Vienne for particulars of the charges that had been brought against Servetus there. One new count was sexual immorality. Servetus replied that rupture had long since made him impotent and had kept him from marriage. He was further accused of having attended Mass at Vienne. He pleaded fear of death as exculpation. He challenged the jurisdiction of a civil court over cases of heresy. He assured the court that he had engaged in no sedition and had not violated the laws of Geneva, and he asked for an attorney better acquainted than himself with these laws to help him in his defense. These pleas were refused. The French Inquisition sent an agent to Geneva to demand that Servetus be sent back to France for the execution of the sentence that had been pronounced against him. Servetus, in tears, begged the council to reject this demand. It did, but the demand may have stimulated the council to equal the Inquisition in severity. On September 1st, 2 enemies of Calvin, Ami Perrin and Philibert Berthier, were allowed to join the judges in the trial. They engaged Calvin in disputes to no result, but they persuaded the council to consult the other churches of Protestant Switzerland on how Servetus should be treated. On September 2nd, Calvin's leadership in the city was again challenged in the council by Patriotes and Libertins. He survived the storm, but the evident desire of the opposition to rescue Servetus may have hardened Calvin to pursue the heretic to the death. However, we should note that the chief prosecutor in the trial was Claude Rigaud, a Libertin. On September 3rd, Servetus presented to the council a written reply to the 38 charges adduced by Calvin. He met each point with keen argument and scriptural or patristic citations. He questioned Calvin's right to interfere in the trial and called him a disciple of Simon Magus, a criminal and a homicide. Calvin answered in 23 pages. These were submitted to Servetus, who returned them to the council with such marginal comments as liar, impostor, hypocrite, miserable wretch. Probably the strain of a month's imprisonment and mental torment had broken Servetus's self-control. Calvin's reports of the trial are themselves in the manner of the time. He writes of Servetus that the dirty dog wiped his snout, the perfidious scamp soils each page with impious ravings. Servetus petitioned the council to indict Calvin as a represser of the truth of Jesus Christ, to exterminate him, confiscate his goods, and with the proceeds reimburse Servetus for the losses he had sustained by Calvin's actions. The suggestion was not favorably received. On October 18th, the replies came in from the Swiss churches whose council had been asked. All advised the condemnation of Servetus, none his execution. On October 25th, Perrin made a last effort to save him by moving for a retrial before the Council of 200. He was overruled. On the 26th, the small council, with no member dissenting, passed sentence of death on 2 counts of heresy, Unitarianism and the rejection of infant baptism. When Servetus heard the sentence, says Calvin, he moaned like a madman and beat his breast and bellowed in Spanish, Misericordia! Misericordia! He asked to talk with Calvin. He pleaded with him for mercy. Calvin offered no more than to give him the final consolations of the true religion if he would retract his heresies. Servetus would not. He asked to be beheaded rather than burned. Calvin was inclined to support this plea, but the aged Farel, in at the death, reproved him for such tolerance, and the council voted that Servetus should be burned alive. The sentence was carried out the next morning, October 27, 1553, on the hill of Champel, just south of Geneva. On the way, Farel importuned Servetus to earn divine mercy by confessing the crime of heresy. According to Farel, the condemned man replied, I am not guilty, I have not merited death, and he besought God to pardon his accusers. He was fastened to a stake by iron chains, and his last book was bound to his side. When the flames reached his face, he shrieked with agony. After half an hour of burning, he died. 7. An appeal for toleration. Catholics and Protestants united in approving the sentence. The Inquisition at Vienne, cheated of its living prey, burned Servetus in effigy. Melanchthon, in a letter to Calvin and Bullinger, gave thanks to the Son of God for the punishment of this blasphemous man, and called the burning a pious and memorable example to all posterity. Pulitzer declared from his pulpit in Strasbourg that Servetus had deserved to be disemboweled and torn to pieces. Bullinger, generally humane, agreed that civil magistrates must punish blasphemy with death. Yet even in Calvin's day some voices spoke for Servetus. A Sicilian wrote a long poem, De Injusto Serveti Incendio. David Joris of Basel, an Anabaptist, published a protest against the execution, but under a pseudonym. After his death, his authorship was discovered. His body was exhumed and publicly burned in 1566. The political opponents of Calvin naturally condemned his treatment of Servetus, and some of his friends deprecated the severity of the sentence as encouraging the Catholics of France to apply the death penalty to Huguenots. Such criticism must have been widespread, for in February 1554, Calvin issued a Defensio Orthodoxae Fidei de Sacra Trinitate contra prodigiosos errores Michaelis Serveti. If, he argued, we believe in the inspiration of the Bible, then we know the truth, and all who oppose it are enemies and blasphemers of God. Since their offense is immeasurably greater than any other crime, the civil authority must punish heretics as worse than murderers, for murder merely kills the body, while heresy, accepted, damns the soul to everlasting hell. This was precisely the Catholic position. Moreover, God himself has explicitly instructed us to kill heretics, to smite with the sword any city that abandons the worship of the true faith revealed by him. Calvin quoted the ferocious decrees of Deuteronomy, chapter 13, verses 5 through 15, chapter 17, verses 2 through 5, Exodus, chapter 22, verse 20, and Leviticus, chapter 24, verse 16, and argued from them with truly burning eloquence, whoever shall maintain that wrong is done to heretics and blasphemers in punishing them makes himself an accomplice in their crime. There is no question here of man's authority. It is God who speaks, and it is clear what law he would have kept in the Church even to the end of the world. Wherefore does he demand of us so extreme severity, if not to show us that due honor is not paid him so long as we set not his service above every human consideration, so that we spare not kin nor blood of any, and forget all humanity when the matter is to combat for his glory? Calvin moderated his conclusions by counseling mercy to those whose heresies were not fundamental, or were clearly due to ignorance or feebleness of mind. But whereas in general he accepted St. Paul as his guide, he refused to use the Pauline expedient of declaring the old law superseded by the new. In truth, the theocracy that he had apparently established would have crumbled into disorder if differences of creed had been allowed public voice. What, meanwhile, had become of the Erasmian spirit of tolerance? Erasmus had been tolerant because he had not been certain. Luther and Melanchthon had abandoned tolerance as they progressed in certainty. Calvin, with lethal precocity, had been certain almost from his 20th year. A few humanists who had studied classic thought and had not been frightened back into the Roman fold by distaste for the violence of theological strife remained to suggest diffidently that certainty in religion and philosophy is unattainable and that therefore theologians and philosophers should not kill. The humanist who spoke most clearly for tolerance amid the clash of certainties had been for a time one of Calvin's closest friends. Sebastian Castellio, born in the French Jura in 1515, became an adept in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, taught Greek at Lyon, lived with Calvin in Strasbourg, was appointed by him rector of the Latin school at Geneva in 1541, and began there a translation of the entire Bible into Ciceronian Latin. While he admired Calvin as a man, he abominated the doctrine of predestination and fretted under the new discipline of body and mind. In 1544 he charged the Genevese ministers with intolerance, impurity, and drunkenness. Calvin complained to the council. Castellio was found guilty of calumny and was banished in 1544. For 9 years he lived in great poverty, supporting a large family, and working at night on his version of the Scriptures. He finished this in 1551. Then, lonesome for the placid drudgery of scholarship, he began again at Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and translated the Bible into French. Finally, in 1553, he obtained a professorship of Greek at the University of Basel. He sympathized with the Unitarians, longed to help Servetus, and was shocked by Calvin's defense of the execution. Under assumed names, he and Caelius Curio published in March 1554 the first modern classic on toleration, De Haereticis Ancint Persequendi, Should Heretics Be Persecuted? The main body of the work was an anthology, compiled by Curio, of Christian pleas for tolerance, from Lactantius and Jerome to Erasmus, the early Luther, and Calvin himself. Castellio contributed the argument in preface and epilogue. For hundreds of years, he pointed out, men had debated free will, predestination, heaven and hell, Christ and the Trinity, and other difficult matters. No agreement had been reached, probably none would ever be reached. But none is necessary, said Castellio. Such disputes do not make men better. All that we need is to carry the Spirit of Christ into our daily lives, to feed the poor, help the sick, and love even our enemies. It seemed to him ridiculous that all the new sects, as well as the old church, should pretend to absolute truth and make their creeds obligatory on those over whom they had physical power. As a result, a man would be orthodox in one city and become a heretic by entering another. He would have to change his religion, like his money, at each frontier. Can we imagine Christ ordering a man to be burned alive for advocating adult baptism? The Mosaic laws calling for the death of a heretic were superseded by the law of Christ, which is one of mercy, not of despotism and terror. If a man denies life after death and rejects all law, he may, said Castellio, be justly silenced by the magistrates, but he should not be killed. Moreover, he thought, persecution of beliefs is futile. Martyrdom for an idea spreads the idea far more rapidly than the martyr could have done had he been allowed to live. What a tragedy, he concluded, that those who had so lately freed themselves from the terrible Inquisition should so soon imitate its tyranny, should so soon force men back into Cimmerian darkness after so promising a dawn. Knowing Castellio's sentiments, Calvin at once recognized his hand in the De Haereticis. He delegated the task of answering it to his most brilliant disciple, Theodore de Besche, or Bez or Beza. Born in Vézelay, of aristocratic lineage, Theodore studied law at Orléans and Bourges, practiced it successfully in Paris, wrote Latin poetry, charmed some women by his wit, or by his prosperity, lived a gay life, married, fell dangerously ill, experienced a sickbed conversion reverse to Loyola's, adopted Protestantism, fled to Geneva, presented himself to Calvin, and was made professor of Greek at the University of Lausanne. It is remarkable that a Protestant refugee from a Huguenot persecuting France should have undertaken to defend persecution. He did it with the skill of a lawyer and the devotion of a friend. In September 1554, he issued his Little Book on the Duty of Civil Magistrates to Punish Heretics. He pointed out again that religious toleration was impossible to one who accepted the divine inspiration of the Scriptures. But if we reject the Bible as God's word, on what shall we build the religious faith that is so clearly indispensable, considering the natural wickedness of men, to moral restraint, social order, and civilization? Nothing would then be left but chaotic doubts disintegrating Christianity. To a sincere believer in the Bible, there could be only one religion. All others must be false or incomplete. Yes, the New Testament preaches a law of love, but this does not excuse us from punishing thieves and murderers. How then does it warrant us in sparing heretics? Castellio returned to the contest in a tract Contra Libellum Calvini, but it lay unpublished for half a century. In another manuscript, De Arte Dubitandi, he anticipated Descartes by making the art of doubting the first step in the pursuit of truth. In Four Dialogues of 1578, he defended free will and the possibility of universal salvation. In 1562, in Conseil à la France désolée, he appealed in vain to Catholics and Protestants to end the civil wars that were devastating France, and to allow every believer in Christ to serve God according not to other men's faith, but to his own. Hardly anyone heard a voice so out of tune with the time. Castellio died in poverty at the age of 48 in 1563. Calvin pronounced his early death a just judgment of a just God. 8. Calvin to the end, 1554 to 1564. Perhaps Calvin knew Castellio's secret leaning toward Unitarianism, belief in a God not triune, therefore a rejection of Christ's divinity, and he can be forgiven for seeing in this basic doubt the beginning of the end for Christianity. He feared this heresy all the more because he found it in Geneva itself, above all among the Protestant fugitives from Italy. These men saw no sense in replacing incredible transubstantiation with incredible predestination. Their rebellion attacked the fundamental assumption of Christianity, that Christ was the Son of God. Matteo Gribaldi, professor of jurisprudence at Padua, had a summer home near Geneva. During the trial of Servetus, he spoke openly against civil punishment for religious opinions and advocated freedom of worship for all. Hailed before the council, he was banished on suspicion of Unitarianism in 1559. He secured appointment as professor of law in the University of Tübingen. Calvin sent word there of Gribaldi's doubts. The university pressed him to sign a Trinitarian confession. Instead, he fled to Bern, where he died of the plague in 1564. Giorgio Blandrada, an Italian physician domiciled in Geneva, was summoned before the council on a charge of questioning the divinity of Christ. He fled to Poland, where he found some tolerance for his heresy. Valentino Gentile, from Calabria, openly expressed Unitarian views in Geneva, was thrown into prison, was sentenced to death in 1557, recanted, was released, went to Lyon, was arrested by the Catholic authorities, but was freed on his assurance that his chief interest lay in refuting Calvin. He joined Blandrata in Poland, returned to Switzerland, was seized by the Bernese magistrates, was convicted of perjury and heresy, and was beheaded in 1566. Amid these battles for the Lord, Calvin continued to live simply and to rule Geneva by the power of a personality armed with the delusions of his followers. His position became stronger as years gave it roots. His only weakness was physical. Headaches, asthma, dyspepsia, stone, gout, and fever racked and thinned his frame and formed his face to taut severity and gloom. A long illness in 1558 to 59 left him lame and feeble, with repeated hemorrhages of the lungs. Thereafter he had to keep to his bed most of the time, though he continued to study, direct, and preach, even when he had to be borne to the sanctuary in a chair. On April 25, 1564, he made his will, full of confidence in his election to everlasting glory. On the 26th, the syndics and the council came to his bedside. He asked their pardon for his outbreaks of anger, and begged them to hold steadfastly to the pure doctrine of the Reformed Church. Farel, now in his 80th year, came from Neuchâtel to bid him au revoir. After many days of prayer and suffering, Calvin found peace on May 27, 1564. His influence was even greater than Luther's, but he walked in a path that Luther had cleared. Luther had protected his new church by rallying German nationalism to its support. The move was necessary, but it tied Lutheranism too narrowly to Teutonic stocks. Calvin loved France and labored to promote the Huguenot cause, but he was no nationalist. Religion was his country, and so his doctrine, however modified, inspired the Protestantism of Switzerland, France, Scotland, and America, and captured large sectors of Protestantism in Hungary, Poland, Germany, Holland, and England. Calvin gave to Protestantism in many lands an organization, confidence, and pride that enabled it to survive 1,000 trials. A year before his death, his pupil, Olivianus, joined with Melanchthon's pupil Ursinus in preparing the Heidelberg Catechism, which became the accepted expression of the Reformed faith in Germany and Holland. Bez and Bullinger reconciled the creeds of Calvin and Zwingli in the Second Helvetic Confession in 1566, which became authoritative for the Reformed churches in Switzerland and France. In Geneva itself, Calvin's work was ably continued by Bez. But year by year the business leaders who controlled the councils resisted more and more successfully the attempts of the consistory and the Venerable Company to place moral checks upon economic operations. After Bez's death in 1608, The merchant princes consolidated their supremacy, and the Genevan Church lost the directive privileges that Calvin had won for it in non-religious affairs. In the 18th century, the influence of Voltaire moderated the Calvinist tradition and ended the sway of a Puritan ethic among the people. Catholicism patiently struggled to recapture a place in the city. It offered a Christianity without gloom and an ethic without severity. In 1954, the population was 42% Catholic, 47% Protestant. But the most impressive man-made structure in Geneva is the noble Reformation Monument, which, running majestically along a park wall, celebrates the victories of Protestantism and raises at its center the powerful figures of Farel, Calvin, Beze, and Knox. Meanwhile, the hard theocracy of Calvin was sprouting democratic buds. The efforts of the Calvinist leaders to give schooling to all, and their inculcation of disciplined character, helped the sturdy burghers of Holland to oust the alien dictatorship of Spain, and supported the revolt of nobles and clergy in Scotland against a fascinating but imperious queen. The stoicism of a hard creed made the strong souls of the Scottish Covenanters, the English and Dutch Puritans, the Pilgrims of New England. It steadied the heart of Cromwell, guided the pen of blind Milton, and broke the power of the backward-facing Stuarts. It encouraged brave and ruthless men to win a continent and spread the base of education and self-government until all men could be free. Men who chose their own pastors soon claimed to choose their governors, and the self-ruled congregation became the self-governed municipality. The myth of divine election justified itself in the making of America. When this function had been performed, the theory of predestination fell into the backwaters of Protestant belief. As social order returned in Europe after the 30 Years' War, in England after the revolutions of 1642 and 1689, in America after 1793, the pride of divine election changed into the pride of work and accomplishment. Men felt stronger and more secure. Fear lessened, and the frightened cruelty that had generated Calvin's God gave way to a more humane vision that compelled a reconception of deity. Decade by decade, the churches that had taken their lead from Calvin discarded the harsher elements of his creed. Theologians dared to believe that all who died in infancy were saved, and one respected divine announced without causing a commotion that the number of the finally lost will be very inconsiderable. We are grateful to be so reassured, and we will agree that even error lives because it serves some vital need. But we shall always find it hard to love the man who darkened the human soul with the most absurd and blasphemous conception of God in all the long and honored history of nonsense. Chapter 22. Francis I and the Reformation in France, 1515 to 1559. 1. Le Roi Grand-Né. He was born under a tree in Cognac on September 12, 1494. His grandfather was Charles of Orleans, the poet. Perhaps song and the love of beauty were in his blood. His father was Charles of Valois and Orleans, Count of Angoulême, who died after many adulteries in the 3rd year of Francis's life. This book is continued on Cassette 6, Side 1.